I found the photograph on a quiet afternoon when the house felt too big for my breath, when even the walls seemed to be listening. It was tucked inside a forgotten envelope, yellowed with age, hidden beneath old tax papers and warranties for appliances we no longer owned. I remember my hands trembling before I even knew why, as if my body had recognized the truth long before my mind dared to look. There he was, my husband, younger, thinner, with that familiar, crooked smile I once believed belonged only to me, and in his arms carefully, tenderly was a baby not mine. For a long moment, I couldn't hear anything, not the ticking clock, not the distant traffic, not even my own heartbeat. The world narrowed to that single image, glossy and cruel in its silence. I sat down on the floor, my back against the filing cabinet, the photograph pressed to my chest as if it might burn through my blouse and brand my skin with its secret. The baby looked no more than a few months old. Soft cheeks, closed eyes. A tiny hand curled around my husband's finger like it already trusted him with its life. My husband had been dead for 12 years. We had been married for 47. I tried to tell myself there must be an explanation, a relative's child, a neighbor's baby, a moment borrowed and misunderstood. But the date scribbled on the back, in his unmistakable handwriting, refused to let me lie to myself. It was written 3 years before our wedding, in the same ink he used to label everything in the house, tools, boxes, even leftovers in the fridge. 3 years before he stood at the altar, looked into my eyes, and promised me a forever built on honesty. I had loved him fiercely, stubbornly. Even now, in my 70s, my body still remembered the shape of his presence beside me in bed, the weight of his arm draped over my waist, the way he cleared his throat before saying something important. We had survived miscarriages, money troubles, long silences, and louder arguments. I thought we had survived the truth too, but this was a truth he took to the grave. As I stared at the photograph, memories began to rearrange themselves like pieces of a puzzle I had never known I was solving. The long business trips when we were newly married. The phone calls he took outside, his voice low and careful. The sudden bursts of generosity toward strangers, the envelopes of cash he claimed were for charity. The way he sometimes looked at children in the park, not with longing exactly, but with something heavier. Regret, maybe. Or fear. I pressed the photo flat on my lap and studied every detail. The background looked like a hospital corridor. Pale walls, a metal door, and behind him, just barely visible in the reflection of a window, a woman's silhouette. I didn't recognize her, and that terrified me more than if I had. That night, I barely slept. The bed felt wrong without him in a new way, as if his absence had grown teeth. I whispered questions into the darkness, the same darkness that had once heard our shared secrets, our laughter, our late-night plans. Who was she? Who was the child? Did he love them? Did he love me less because of them? By morning, I had made a decision. Old age has a way of stripping away patience for lies. If there was a truth still breathing somewhere in this world, I was going to find it even if it broke whatever fragile piece I had left. I began with the handwriting. I pulled out old letters, birthday cards, Notes he'd left on the counter when he woke before me. The date on the photo matched a time he told me he was between jobs, a period I remembered as thin and anxious, when money was tight and hope felt conditional. I remembered comforting him, telling him we would get through anything together, anything except this, it seemed. A week later, I visited the old hospital named on the back of the photograph. It had been converted into a rehabilitation center, its walls freshly painted, its past politely buried. I felt foolish standing at the reception desk, an old woman with shaking hands and a question no one expected. "I'm looking for records," I said softly, "from a long time ago." The young man behind the desk gave me a sympathetic smile, the kind reserved for people who look like they might cry or collapse without much warning. He told me records that old were archived off-site. He told me it would take time. Time, I realized, was the one thing I suddenly didn't want to waste. On my way out, I sat on a bench across the street and watched young mothers push strollers past me. Every baby felt like an accusation, every laugh, a reminder of something stolen not from me alone, but from that child, wherever they were now. I clutched my purse, feeling the edge of the photograph inside like a blade. My husband had built a life with me. A good life, I thought. But somewhere along the way, he had also built another story, one he never trusted me enough to share. And as I sat there, surrounded by strangers and memories, a thought crept in that made my stomach twist with dread. What if this baby hadn't disappeared into the past? What if this child had grown up close to us, watching, waiting, knowing something I never did? The photograph felt heavier then, as if it had finally decided to tell me its secret, but only the first one. I went home that afternoon with my head bowed, not from age, but from the weight of what I was carrying inside me. The house greeted me the way it always had, quiet, loyal, pretending nothing had changed. The clock still ticked, the curtains still breathed with the breeze. His slippers still waited by the door like patient dogs. But I knew now that this house had been built on a truth with a missing room. I spread the photograph on the kitchen table and stared at it again, this time forcing myself not to flinch. I studied my husband's face with the precision of a stranger, the softness in his eyes, the careful way he held the baby, as if afraid of breaking something already fragile. That wasn't the face of a man holding a neighbor's child. That was the face of a father. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. Father. He and I had tried for years. 2 pregnancies lost before they could take shape. 2 tiny graves I still visited in my dreams. He had held me then, whispered that it wasn't my fault, that love didn't need blood to be real. I believed him. Or maybe I needed to. Now I wondered if those losses had driven him elsewhere, or if the elsewhere had already happened, and I was just late to the pain. I began going through his things more carefully, no longer with nostalgia, but with suspicion. The garage first. Old boxes labeled in his neat handwriting, tools wrapped like gifts. At the bottom of one box, beneath tangled extension cords, I found an envelope addressed in a woman's name I didn't recognize. It had never been opened. Inside was a letter dated the same year as the photograph. My hands shook so badly I had to sit down on the concrete floor to read it. It was short, polite, too polite for something so intimate. She thanked him for everything he'd done, said the baby was healthy. Said she hoped he had found happiness. No return address, no demands, just gratitude and goodbye. I pressed the letter to my lips before I realized what I was doing. It smelled like dust and oil and time. It smelled like him. He had been involved. Enough to be thanked. Enough to be remembered. I felt anger then, not sharp but deep, like a bruise pressed too long. Anger for the secret. For the silence. For the fact that he had let me live my life believing I was childless, when somewhere out there his child might have been blowing out birthday candles, taking first steps, learning to speak words I would never hear. That night, I dreamed of a baby crying in the dark. I searched room after room, opening doors that led to nothing but shadows. When I finally woke, my pillow was wet and my chest ached as if I had been running. In the following days, something strange happened. My memories began betraying me. The woman who lived 2 houses down years ago, the quiet one who moved away suddenly. The boy who used to visit her, dark-haired like my husband, who stared at me once with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The charity dinners where my husband disappeared for hours, returning flushed and distracted. The birthday he forgot only once, but now it screamed at me. I began writing things down, afraid my mind would collapse under the weight of possibility. I traced timelines, matched dates, built theories that made my stomach churn. One name kept resurfacing in my thoughts. A woman I'd met briefly decades ago at a community fundraiser. She had laughed easily, too easily. She'd touched my husband's arm when she spoke. He had stiffened then, just slightly. I remembered feeling an inexplicable chill. Her name was Ruth. I hadn't thought of her in years. On impulse that frightened me with its clarity, I searched for her. The internet is both a blessing and a curse for old souls like me, but desperation sharpens learning. It didn't take long to find an obituary. Ruth had died 5 years earlier, but beneath her name was a list of survivors, and there it was, a son. His name stopped my breath. Not because I recognized it, but because it sounded so much like the name my husband and I had once chosen for the baby we never had, similar enough to be coincidence or confession. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. If Ruth was the woman in the photograph's reflection, if her son was the baby my husband held, then the truth wasn't buried with him. It was alive, grown, somewhere close enough to be listed, searchable, real. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt afraid of meeting someone, afraid of what he might know, afraid of what he might want, afraid of what he might take from me, not money or possessions, but the version of my life I had clung to like scripture. Still, something inside me, older than fear, stronger than pride, pushed me forward. I sent a message. It was simple, careful, anonymous. I believe our lives may be connected by someone we both loved. I stared at the screen for hours after sending it, my finger hovering over the power button like I could still undo it. When a reply finally came, it was only one sentence. I've been waiting for someone to say that to me. My hands went cold. Whatever my husband had hidden all those years, it was no longer sleeping. And I realized then with a sinking certainty that the photograph hadn't been the beginning, it had been an invitation. I didn't reply right away. I couldn't. That single sentence sat on my screen like a living thing, breathing, watching me. I've been waiting for someone to say that to me. Waiting how long? In what way? With hope or with resentment? I set the phone face down on the table and backed away from it, as if it might reach out and grab me. My knees felt weak. I lowered myself into the armchair by the window. The same chair my husband used to sit in every evening, rubbing his temples as if the world pressed too hard against his skull. Had he been thinking of this moment back then? Had he imagined a day when the truth would crawl its way out of hiding and land in my lap like an accusation? The afternoon light stretched across the floor, catching dust in the air. I watched it drift and thought about how much of my life had been spent trusting shadows not to move. Eventually, I picked the phone back up. My fingers hovered, then typed slowly, deliberately. The way you speak when you're afraid, every word might collapse, something fragile. How long? I wrote. The reply came almost instantly. All my life. I closed my eyes. That answer hurt more than any confession could have. We exchanged a few messages after that, careful and restrained, like two people approaching a wild animal from opposite sides. He didn't accuse. He didn't beg. He simply told me he had grown up knowing very little, only that his father was married to someone else, that he had chosen responsibility over disruption, that silence had been the price of peace. Peace. What a cruel word. He told me his mother never spoke ill of my husband, said he had provided quietly, paid for school, showed up when he could, briefly, always at a distance, never stayed long enough to be seen by the wrong eyes. I wondered how many times I had been sitting across from that same man at home, complaining about groceries or neighbors, while he carried another life in his pocket like a stone. I asked for a picture. There was a pause this time, long enough for my heart to race. Then my phone buzzed. The man staring back at me was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same slant of the mouth, even the crease between the brows that deepened when he frowned. It was like looking at my husband through time, what he might have looked like if life had taken a slightly different turn. I felt dizzy. I pressed my palm to my chest and laughed once, a sharp, broken sound that startled even me. "Of course," I whispered to the empty room. "Of course you look like him. He was kind, too. That was the worst part. He didn't come at me with anger or entitlement. He told me he didn't want anything. Said he'd lived his life without expecting more than the truth. Said he only wanted to know who I was, the wife, the woman who had unknowingly shared her marriage with a ghost. We agreed to meet. I chose a cafe across town, neutral ground, a place my husband had never liked. I arrived early and sat with my back to the wall, the way I always did when nerves crept in. I kept imagining him walking through the door and calling me Mother by mistake. When he finally came in, I knew him immediately. He hesitated when he saw me, as if recognizing something familiar he'd never seen before. We stared at each other for a long moment, two reflections of a man who was no longer there to explain himself. He smiled first. That smile undid me. We talked for hours, about his childhood, about my marriage, about the spaces where our stories overlapped without touching. He told me how he used to watch my husband from afar sometimes, the way a child watches a stranger they somehow belong to. How he'd attended my husband's funeral and stood at the back, unnoticed, listening to me speak about a man he knew in fragments. "I wanted to tell you then," he said quietly, "but I didn't want to take your grief and make it mine. That broke something open inside me. I went home that evening feeling hollowed out and heavy all at once. The truth was no longer theoretical. It had a face, a voice, a history that ran parallel to mine like a second heartbeat. In the weeks that followed, he and I spoke often, more easily than I expected. We shared memories of the same man from opposite sides of the mirror. Sometimes our stories matched, sometimes they didn't. Those were the moments that hurt the most. One night, as I lay awake listening to the house settle, a realization crept over me with chilling clarity. My husband hadn't just hidden a child, he had hidden a choice. Every day he came home to me, he chose this life, me, our quiet dinners, our shared routines, and every day, somewhere else, his son lived with the knowledge of being chosen second or not at all. I didn't know how to feel about that. What I did know was this: the story wasn't finished. Not yet, because there was still one question neither of us had asked out loud. Why had my husband kept the photograph? Why hide it, but not destroy it? And why, after all these years, had it surfaced now when I was alone, older, and finally brave enough to look? The answer, I suspected, was going to hurt more than anything I'd uncovered so far. The photograph haunted me after that, not as an object anymore, but as a question with teeth. I carried it from room to room like a talisman I didn't know how to bury. I kept seeing my husband's hand beneath the baby's back, protective, deliberate. He had chosen to keep that image, not in a frame, not in a wallet, but hidden, saved, yet ashamed. Love mixed with guilt. A compromise that sounded exactly like him. I asked his son about it during one of our longer phone calls. I tried to keep my voice steady, but age has thinned my defenses. Did he ever mention a photograph? I asked. There was silence on the line, the kind that stretches. Yes, he finally said. He said it was the only proof he allowed himself. That sentence sank into me slowly like cold water. Proof of what? Of fatherhood? Of weakness? Of a life he didn't have the courage to live fully? His son told me that my husband used to visit him on his birthday, always briefly, always alone. No gifts that could be traced. Just envelopes and advice and that same crooked smile. He never stayed long enough to be asked questions. He never stayed long enough to be loved openly. He said he couldn't afford to be selfish twice, his son told me. Once was already too much. I hung up the phone and cried harder than I had at the funeral, because suddenly I understood something terrible and tender at the same time. My husband hadn't lived a double life out of carelessness. He had lived it out of fear. Fear of losing me. Fear of destroying the fragile happiness we built after so much loss. Fear of facing his own mistakes and asking forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. But understanding does not erase betrayal. It just gives it a softer place to land. I went to his grave the next morning. The cemetery was quiet, the air sharp with the smell of wet grass. I hadn't brought flowers. I brought the photograph. I knelt there, an old woman speaking to a man who could no longer defend himself, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to be angry out loud. "You should have told me," I whispered. "I could have handled it. I handled everything else." My voice broke. "You let me believe my life was smaller than it was." I told him about his son, about the resemblance, about the way the truth had found me anyway, creeping out from behind paperwork and dust like it had been waiting for the right moment. And then this surprised me. I thanked him. Not for the lie, never for that, but for loving me enough to be afraid of losing me. The weeks that followed changed the shape of my days. His son, no. The man began visiting sometimes. Carefully, respectfully. He never called me anything but my name. Never crossed a line I hadn't drawn myself. But I noticed the way he looked around the house, absorbing details, memorizing pieces of a life he had never been allowed to enter. One afternoon, he stood in the living room and froze. "He had this clock," he said softly, pointing. "In his apartment, same one." I stared at it. I had always thought it was just a clock. Suddenly it was a bridge. We talked then about the future, an awkward word at my age. He said he didn't expect inheritance, didn't want to disrupt anything. I laughed at that, a little bitterly. "There's nothing left to disrupt," I told him. "Only to rearrange." It took me a long time to decide what to do next, longer than I care to admit. Pride wrestled with loneliness. Betrayal wrestled with compassion. In the end, it was memory that decided for me. I remembered the woman I used to be, the one who wanted children so badly it ached, the one who used to imagine what kind of mother she would have been, patient, protective, honest. I invited him for dinner, not as a guest, not as an obligation, as family, whatever that word meant now. We ate slowly, spoke carefully, laughed once, then twice, and in the middle of the meal, something unexpected happened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. Not the same one. This one showed my husband older, grayer, sitting on a park bench with his arm around a teenage boy. They were both laughing at something outside the frame. "He asked me not to show you this unless the time was right," he said quietly. "He said, if you ever knew, you should know this too." My chest tightened. On the back, in my husband's handwriting, were words I recognized instantly. Words he used to leave for me on notes by the coffee maker. Some truths come late, but love was always early. I covered my mouth. Tears slid down my face without resistance. In that moment, the twist revealed itself not as cruelty, but as consequence. My husband had not chosen one life over another. He had chosen fragments of both and left the women who loved him to assemble the pieces after he was gone. That was his final betrayal and his final gift, because now, in the quiet years of my life, when I thought all revelations were behind me, I was no longer alone in my remembering. The photograph that once felt like a wound had become a doorway, and I stepped through it not to forgive completely, not to forget, but to finally live in the full, complicated truth of the life I thought I knew. There was still one part left of this story, not his, not his son's, mine, and I was finally ready to tell it. After that dinner, after the second photograph and the words written in my husband's careful hand, something in me shifted permanently. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't peace either. It was acceptance's quieter cousin, recognition. The kind that comes when you stop fighting the shape of your life and finally trace it with your fingers, even the sharp edges. His son began coming over once a week, never announced, never assumed, always asking if it was a good time, as if afraid I might suddenly remember I wasn't supposed to have space for him. I noticed how he removed his shoes at the door the same way my husband used to, lining them neatly against the wall. I noticed how he washed dishes while we talked, hands moving automatically, familiar with the rhythm of a home that had never been his. Sometimes I caught myself watching him too closely. The way he tilted his head when listening, the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated. And each time, guilt followed close behind, whispering that I was stealing something that didn't belong to me. But then another thought would rise, steadier and older. Nothing in life belongs cleanly to anyone. One afternoon, while we sorted through old photo albums, he paused over a picture of my husband and me taken on our 10th anniversary. We were young, smiling, unaware of how much silence lay ahead. "He looks happy," he said. "He was," I replied. Then, after a moment, I added, "So were you, I hope." He nodded slowly. "Most of the time." That answer held years inside it. As weeks turned into months, the truth began weaving itself into my routines. His son helped me with errands, fixed the loose hinge on the back door, took notes when the doctor spoke too quickly for my ears. The neighbors began noticing. Questions hovered, unasked but loud. I didn't offer explanations. At my age, you learn that people don't need the whole story, only the parts they can carry. One evening, while the sky bruised itself purple outside the windows, he asked me something I'd been both expecting and dreading. "Did you ever want to know about my mother?" he asked gently. I hesitated. I had built Ruth into a shadowy figure in my mind, part rival, part victim, part stranger. To give her detail felt dangerous. "Yes," I said finally, "but I'm afraid of what I'll feel." He smiled sadly. "Me too, every time." He told me about her illness, about how she never remarried, about how she kept my husband's letters in a box beneath her bed, rereading them when nights grew too long. He said she never blamed me, never spoke my name with bitterness. "She said you were innocent," he told me. She said loving him meant accepting the shape of his fear. That sentence stayed with me for days. Fear, not desire, not cruelty, fear. I went back to my own memories then, revisiting moments with new eyes. The nights my husband held me too tightly, the way he flinched whenever the phone rang late, the guilt I'd mistaken for exhaustion, how small he sometimes made himself, as if afraid the world would notice him too much. I had thought love was enough to make people brave. I was wrong. One morning, while dusting the bookshelf, I found something I hadn't seen before, a small envelope tucked behind a row of hardcovers. Inside was a handwritten note, not dated, not signed, but unmistakably his. If you are reading this, it means the truth finally found you. I am sorry I was not brave enough to be the one who led it to you. My breath caught. I loved you the only way I knew how, imperfectly, fearfully, completely. Please don't let my silence steal the rest of your life. I sat down hard on the couch, the note trembling in my hands. He had known. Somehow, he had known this day would come. That the past doesn't stay buried forever, it waits. That night, I made a decision I hadn't realized I was circling. I called a lawyer, not to contest anything, not to rewrite wills or claim damages, but to make something clear while I still could. I adjusted what little I had savings, the house, the small things that make up the residue of a long life, not out of obligation, out of intention. When I told his son, he protested immediately. "I don't need anything," he said. "I never came for that." "I know," I replied. "That's why you deserve it." We sat in silence after that, the kind that doesn't demand filling. In the quiet years of old age, endings and beginnings blur together. You stop thinking in straight lines. You start thinking in echoes. One evening, as we shared tea, he asked me if I ever regretted staying with my husband. The question was careful, respectful, but it struck deep. I thought of the laughter, the grief, the decades stitched together by ordinary days. I thought of the photograph that had shattered my certainty and the man sitting across from me now, living proof of a love I'd never known existed. "No," I said at last, "but I regret that we were both kept smaller than we needed to be." He nodded. I saw relief there, and something else. Belonging, and that frightened me almost as much as it comforted me, because I knew deep down that my story wasn't moving toward quiet closure. It was moving toward a choice, one final act that would define not my husband's legacy, but mine. The choice did not announce itself all at once. It arrived the way most truths do in old age, slowly, gently, disguised as ordinary days. It came in the sound of the kettle boiling while he read the newspaper at my table, in the way he reached automatically for my arm when I stood too quickly, in how the house, once hollow with absence, now carried footsteps again. I began to understand that legacy is not what we leave behind when we die. It is what we decide to carry while we are still here. My health faltered that winter. Nothing dramatic at first, just fatigue, a heaviness in my bones, breath that shortened like patience. The doctor used careful words, the kind meant to soften endings. I listened without fear. I had lived long enough to know when life was beginning to close its book. It was during one of those afternoons, wrapped in blankets, sunlight trembling through the curtains, that I asked him to bring me the photograph. The first one. He hesitated, then placed it in my hands. My husband, the baby, the secret that had cracked my life open. "I used to think this photo destroyed my marriage," I said softly. But now I know that's not true. He waited. It destroyed my illusion, I continued. And that's not the same thing. I looked up at him, at this man who had lived his life in the shadow of my marriage, and felt something settle inside me at last. You were never a mistake, I said. You were a consequence. His eyes filled. He looked away, ashamed of tears he had earned decades ago. I don't want to be remembered as the woman who was lied to, I said. I want to be remembered as the woman who chose what to do with the truth. That night I wrote letters. Not many, just enough. To neighbors who had known me forever. To distant relatives who might ask questions later. I didn't confess everything. I didn't need to. But I named him. I placed him in my life in ink, where he could no longer be erased. I asked him to sit with me as I signed the last document. My hand shook, not from doubt, but from the weight of finality. This doesn't make you replace anyone, I told him. It only makes you real. He held my hand then, the way my husband once did, steady, present, unafraid. And for the first time since that photograph surfaced, I felt no resentment toward the dead man who had shaped us both, only a quiet, sorrowful affection. My last months were not dramatic. They were full of conversation, of shared meals, of stories told twice and then laughed about. He brought me photographs of his childhood. I told him stories of the man he never fully knew, both the good and the cowardly. I did not absolve my husband completely. Love does not require that kind of lie. But I forgave him enough to stop carrying the anger with me. One evening, near the end, I asked to be wheeled into the garden. The air smelled like earth and endings. He wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I used to think my life was small, I told him. Just one marriage, one home, one story. He listened. But it turns out, I said, smiling faintly, it was bigger than I ever imagined, big enough to hold more than one truth. When I slept after that, it was deeply. On my final morning, he was there. I knew him before I opened my eyes. Some recognitions don't need sight. Stay, I whispered. I'm here, he said, and I believed him. When I was gone, the house did not empty. That was the miracle. My husband's secret did not end my story. It completed it. The child in the photograph grew into the man who closed my eyes. The truth that once terrified me became the thing that saved me from dying alone. If you ever find an old photograph that changes everything you thought you knew, don't ask why it was hidden. Ask what it is asking of you now. Because love does not end where truth begins. Sometimes it begins there. After I was gone, the story did not stop the way people like to imagine stories stopping. There was no clean silence, no neat curtain falling. Life rarely offers that kindness. Instead, it carried on in the soft, persistent way it always does, through routines, through memory, through the quiet obligations love leaves behind. If I could speak now, from wherever old souls are stored, I would tell you that death felt less like falling and more like being gently unburdened. The pain slipped away first, then the fear. What remained was clarity. He stayed in the house for a while after my funeral, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood that places need time to learn new shapes. He didn't rush to change anything. My husband's slippers stayed by the door. The clock ticked on the wall. The photographs remained where they had always been, except one, the first photograph, the one that began everything. He placed it in a drawer in the living room, not hidden, not displayed, exactly where truth belongs when it has finally been honored. People came, of course, neighbors with casseroles and curious eyes, distant relatives with practiced sympathy. Some of them noticed him and asked questions in lowered voices. Who was he? How did he know me? Why was he here? He answered simply, "She was my family." And because no one ever knows how to argue with certainty, spoken softly, they accepted it. He read my letters slowly, the ones I had written in my careful hand, making sure the ink did not tremble. In them, I did not explain myself. I claimed myself. I spoke of choices made late but made fully. I spoke of forgiveness as something living, not granted once but practiced daily. I spoke of him, without apology, as someone who belonged. There were moments, I know, when the weight of it all pressed too hard against his chest, when he wondered if his father's silence had stolen years that could never be returned, when anger rose like an old tide, asking to be acknowledged. But there were also moments of peace. Like the afternoon, he fixed the loose hinge on the back door and realized his hands were steady now. Like the morning, he drank coffee at my table and caught himself smiling at nothing. Like the night he slept in the guest room and dreamed not of absence, but of continuity. He visited his mother's grave with a different posture now, taller, less guarded. He told her about me, about how I had known the truth and chosen not to turn away, about how love had arrived in his life late, but had arrived all the same. He kept the house, not as a shrine, not as a museum of grief, but as a home. He changed little things over time, new curtains, a repaired step, a chair moved closer to the window. He understood something my husband never quite did, that preserving the past does not mean freezing it. It means letting it breathe. Sometimes he spoke to me out loud, mostly in the evenings, about work, about memories that surfaced unexpectedly, about how strange it felt to miss someone he had known for such a short time and yet so completely. And if I could have answered him, I would have said this: you were never late. You arrived exactly when courage finally outweighed fear. As for my husband, I think of him differently now. Not as the man who betrayed me. Not even as the man who loved me imperfectly. I think of him as the man who tried to outrun his own weakness and failed quietly. He paid for that failure with a lifetime of silence. I paid for it with shock, and his son paid for it with waiting. But in the end, the truth claimed us all equally. It did not favor one heart over another. It simply asked to be seen. That is the part people misunderstand about secrets. They don't disappear when hidden. They mature. They grow heavier. They wait for the moment they will finally be strong enough to demand their place. I was an old woman when mine did, and that was not a tragedy. It was a mercy, because I had lived long enough to understand that love is not proven by perfection, but by what we do once the illusion breaks, by whether we choose bitterness or expansion, whether we close our hands or open them wider than we thought possible. If you are listening to this and thinking of your own life, your own photographs tucked away, your own truths half buried under years of routine, I will leave you with this. It is never too late to decide who you are going to be in the presence of truth. I was a wife. I was betrayed. I was loved. I was lied to. And still I chose connection over erasure. That was my final act. Not anger, not denial, but recognition. The baby in that photograph did not steal my marriage. He completed my story, and in the end, when the house grew quiet again, it was not empty. It was full of truth. And that, at last, was enough. Time moved forward after that, the way it always does, indifferent, steady, unconcerned with how much meaning we try to stitch into it. Seasons passed through the house like careful visitors. Spring softened the garden. Summer filled the rooms with light. And in every season, the truth lived there quietly, no longer demanding attention, only acknowledgement. He grew into the house in ways neither of us could have predicted, not loudly, not defiantly, but with the slow confidence of someone who has finally been given permission to exist without apology. He hung new photographs on the walls, not replacing the old ones, but standing beside them. Past and present learning how to share the same air. Sometimes he would sit in my old chair by the window, reading, pausing now and then, as if he felt my presence hovering just out of sight. And maybe I was. Or maybe memory itself had weight. He never called me mother. That word carried too much history, too many ghosts. Instead, when people asked who I had been to him, he would say, "She chose me," and that was enough. There came a day when he finally opened the last box in the attic, the one even I had avoided. Inside were the remnants of my husband's private life, old notebooks, receipts, letters unsent. Among them was something neither of us had expected, a journal. Not detailed, not confessional, just fragments, thoughts written late at night, doubts, fears. One page stopped him cold. If there is a reckoning, I hope it comes when she is strong enough to survive it, and when he is old enough to understand that silence was never lack of love. He closed the journal and sat there for a long time, the dust floating around him like suspended years. At last, he understood what had taken me a lifetime to learn. Some people are not villains or heroes, they are simply afraid. And fear can shape an entire family without ever showing its face. He did not excuse his father completely, nor did I want him to. Love that excuses everything is not love, it is erasure. But he let go of the sharpest edge of his anger. He let it dull into something usable. Resolve. He chose to live differently. He married later than most. Chose honesty even when it was uncomfortable. When his own child was born, he held that baby the way his father once had, but without secrecy, without shadows. There was no hidden photograph, no half-life, just presence. On the wall of his home hung a small framed note written in my handwriting, the one I had left behind on purpose. Truth does not destroy love, it only rearranges it. Visitors sometimes asked about it. He would smile and say it belonged to someone who'd taught him what family really meant. Years later, when the house finally changed hands, when new laughter replaced old echoes, The story did not vanish. It traveled forward in conversations, in lessons quietly taught, in the way one man chose courage over convenience because an old woman once chose him over bitterness. If you had asked me, when I was young and hopeful and unscarred, what kind of life I wanted, I would have said something simple: a faithful husband, children, certainty. I did not get certainty. I got something harder. I got truth, and truth gave me more than certainty ever could. It gave me choice. I chose not to let betrayal be the loudest voice in my final years. I chose not to let another woman's child remain a secret shaped like shame. I chose to expand instead of contract, to name love even when it arrived late and imperfect. So when you hear stories like mine, do not ask whether I was wronged. That answer is easy. Ask instead what I did once I knew. Because the photograph I found that day did not end my marriage. It did not erase my past. It did not steal my place. It asked me who I would be when the truth stood in front of me, breathing, and I answered, not with rage, not with silence, but with recognition. That was my ending, not tidy, not painless, but honest. And in a life built on love and fear and secrets and late-arriving truths, honesty was the bravest thing I ever chose. There is one last thing I need to say, because endings are only proper when nothing important is left unsaid. I know that now. Old age teaches you that silence is rarely graceful, it is usually unfinished. If I could step back into my body for one more moment, I would return to the day I found that photograph. I would still feel the shock, the grief, the betrayal curling through my chest like smoke. I would not take that away from myself. Pain was the price of truth, and I paid it honestly. But I would also place a hand on that younger version of me, still elderly, still tired, but not yet transformed, and I would whisper what took me years to understand: this will not ruin you, because it didn't. It changed me, and change, when faced instead of fled, can be a strange kind of grace. I lived most of my life believing fidelity was the highest form of love. That loyalty meant choosing one path and never looking sideways. That secrets were sins without redemption. I believed love was proven by consistency, by routine, by staying. What I learned at the end was more complicated and more human. Love is proven by what survives the truth. My husband loved me. I know that now without doubt. He loved me imperfectly, fearfully, and selfishly at times, but he loved me in the only way he knew how. His greatest failure was not the child. It was his belief that I was too fragile for the truth, and my greatest victory was proving him wrong. I was not fragile. I was flexible. I bent. I cracked. I hurt. But I did not shatter. And in that bending, I made space for his son, for a fuller history, for a version of myself that was no longer defined solely by what had been taken from me, but by what I chose to give. I did not become his mother. That role belonged to someone else, a woman who loved quietly and endured invisibly. I honored her by not competing with her memory. I honored myself by not pretending she didn't exist. Instead, I became something rarer. I became a witness to a life lived in fragments, a witness to a child grown in silence, a witness to my own strength arriving late but arriving all the same. People often ask why I didn't rage, why I didn't expose, why I didn't burn the past down once I knew. They imagine strength as destruction. They imagine justice as noise. But strength, at my age, looked like restraint. Justice looked like intention. And power looked like choosing what kind of ending I wanted. I did not want an ending shaped by bitterness. I did not want my last chapter to be about what my husband stole from me. I wanted it to be about what I did with what remained. And what remained was love, not romantic love, not the kind that demands exclusivity or promises purity, but the quieter love, the braver one, the kind that says, I see you, you are real, you belong somewhere now. That is the love I offered his son, that is the love I offered myself, and that is the love that carried me out of this life without regret. If you are listening to my story and waiting for punishment or revenge, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Real life rarely ends with villains exposed and heroes crowned. It ends with people making peace with the truth they can no longer outrun. My husband paid for his choices with lifelong fear. His son paid with waiting. I paid with shock. But none of us paid with erasure. That matters, because stories like mine are not warnings. They are invitations. Invitations to look again at what you think defines you, at what you believe would destroy you if it were true, at the photographs you've never dared to turn over. You are not ruined by truth. You are revealed by it. I was a wife who believed her marriage was whole. I was an old woman who discovered it had been shared. And I was still at the very end someone capable of choosing generosity over resentment. That was my legacy. Not the house, not the money, not the marriage I once thought I understood. My legacy was this. When faced with the most painful truth of my life, I did not close my hands into fists. I opened them. And what I found there was not emptiness. It was connection. That is how my story ends. Not with certainty, not with perfection, but with a truth finally allowed to breathe and a life, at last, honestly complete. If I linger now, it is only because some stories refuse to close quietly. They hover, not to haunt, but to be understood fully like a breath you didn't realize you were holding until it finally leaves you. I want you to know that, in my last days, I did not feel cheated by life. I felt enlarged by it. The truth did not shrink my memories. It sharpened them. It gave them edges and depth and weight. It turned what I thought was a simple portrait into a mural, layered and flawed and achingly human. There were moments, yes, when grief returned without warning, when I would reach for my husband's side of the bed out of habit and feel the echo of absence sting all over again. But even then, the pain had changed. It no longer felt like betrayal pressing on my chest. It felt like complexity settling into place. I had loved a man who was not whole with me, but I had still been loved. That mattered. In the final weeks, as my body tired more easily and my voice softened, I found myself telling stories aloud, not for anyone else, but for myself. Stories of the woman I had been before marriage, before disappointment, before learning how much silence could shape a life. I spoke of dances and summers and the way I once believed love could be clean and uncomplicated. I did not mock that younger self. I honored her. Innocence is not foolishness. It is simply untested hope. And hope, I realized, had followed me longer than I thought. Hope had been there when I chose to meet a stranger carrying my husband's face. Hope had been there when I invited truth into my home instead of locking the door. Hope had been there when I decided my ending would not be written by fear. The night before I slipped away, I dreamed of the photograph again. But this time, it was different. My husband was no longer young. The baby was no longer small. And I was there, too, standing beside them, not separate, not excluded. We were not smiling. We were simply present, equal in the frame. When I woke, I understood. The photograph had never been about what came before me. It had been about what came after silence, after fear, after the lie that love must be simple to be real. I want you to understand something important, especially if you are younger, especially if you are afraid of what truth might do to your life. Truth does not demand that you forgive everything. It does not demand that you stay. It does not demand that you sacrifice yourself on the altar of someone else's mistake. Truth only asks that you choose consciously. I chose to let the truth make me bigger, not smaller. I chose not to compete with a ghost. I chose not to measure my worth against a secret, and in doing so, I reclaimed something precious, my authorship. For most of my life, I believed stories were things that happened to us. Love stories, marriage stories, betrayal stories. I believed we were carried along by them, powerless to change their course. But at the end, I learned that the final chapters are always ours, even when the ink is shaky, even when the page is short, even when the truth arrives late and breathless, asking to be let in. I let it in, and because I did, the house did not feel like a tomb. The memories did not feel poisoned. The man who shared my husband's blood did not feel like an intruder. He felt like continuity. When my eyes finally closed, I did not think of the wedding day or the photograph or the lie. I thought of a quiet afternoon light, of footsteps in a house that would not fall silent, of a truth that had finally found a place to rest. That is how I left this world, not confused, not angry, not diminished, but aware. Aware that love is rarely what we imagine it will be. Aware that fear can shape entire lifetimes. Aware that courage does not always arrive early, but it still counts when it does. If my story stays with you, let it be for this reason. You are allowed to change after the truth. You are allowed to expand instead of break. You are allowed to choose dignity over destruction. I was an old woman when I learned this, and it was not too late. It was exactly on time. Some stories don't need more plot. They need stillness. Everything that mattered has already been said. The secret was uncovered. The lie was faced. The truth was chosen. And love was allowed to change shape instead of dying. Nothing was undone. Nothing was erased. No one was made pure or punished enough to satisfy an audience. And that is why the ending is real. What remained after all the revelations was not anger, not regret, not even forgiveness in its dramatic form, but integration. A life finally seen whole. A marriage understood without illusion. A child no longer hidden. A woman no longer defined by what she was denied. If there is a final sentence, it is not a twist. It is a settling. The photograph stopped hurting because it stopped being a weapon. It became what it always was, a piece of truth waiting for a heart strong enough to hold it. And in the end, she was.